Enjoy listening to Pacifica Radio's live coverage of the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attacks on the U.S. Capitol. I'm Mitch Jeserich. The committee has concluded its fifth day in which it concentrated on the White House campaign to force the Justice Department to interfere at the state level concerning the certification and the counting of the elections in such states as Georgia and Arizona and Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. I'm Mitch Jeserich. We're going to be with you for the next hour and 20 minutes or so. In the next hour, we're going to have a number of guests on over that period of time. But in the next hour, we'll also begin taking listener calls for questions and comments. And we'll be joined by John Nichols for the hour of The Nation magazine, who will join us for that period of time. But joining me right now is Praveen Fernandes. Praveen Fernandes is the vice president at the Constitutional Accountability Center. Praveen Fernandes, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our broadcast.
It's such a pleasure to be with you, Mitch. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. Really wanted to have you on because today was so much about the Justice Department and what really, in a way, what role does the Justice Department play in society? And of course, the takeaway from today's hearing is trying to force the Justice Department to act at a local level in a state concerning its elections is crossing a line it should not cross. Can you explain to me, for legal scholars, for people who understand this and the role of the Justice Department, what is the role of the Justice Department and why would having the Justice Department being involved, now we can get into the whole issue, well, the allegations were fraud, but why is it stepping beyond Trump's bounds to try to force the Justice Department to act in the states in question?
Well, it's a great question. First of all, the high-ranking lawyers at the Justice Department, of course, serve the country at large. These are not the president's lawyers. These are America's lawyers. These are not White House counsel. These are not the president's private lawyers. They are lawyers that have a very, very circumscribed role at the Department of Justice. The Attorney General obviously is our nation's sort of chief prosecutor for important things, upholding American laws. It is definitely, in theory, if there was evidence of fraud in elections, part of the ambit for the Department of Justice to investigate those claims. What's striking here, through clear testimony by the president's own appointees, was that there was patently no evidence of fraud here, and that lack of any evidence was presented to the president multiple times, not only by his close circle of appointees, reinforced by White House counsel's office, and reinforced, quite frankly, by the belief of, close family members who seem to believe, of course, Attorney General Bill Barr's acknowledgments that there was no evidence of election irregularities that would in any way change the results.
Is the Justice Department different from all the other departments of government in this way? Is it different from the Department of Homeland Security or Department of Agriculture or Education, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure, right. Some of those others, the Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security, which came up briefly in today's hearing when they came up with the question of possible machines that had been tampered with, et cetera, and they ran down those kinds of claims, which are about general security, including cybersecurity threats to the United States. And what you saw there is Homeland Security, too, said that there was no evidence of that. It seems like the president and his allies were trying to enlist the Department of Homeland Security and potentially DOJ in working to seize machines. And it's clear that thankfully, officials at both Department of Homeland Security and DOJ resisted that unlawful call.
Can you think of anything like this before in history? I mean, I guess I was thinking, John Mitchell, former Attorney General, actually went to jail. Can you think of anything like that has happened, like we were talking about today, concerning the 2020 election in history and abusing the Justice Department, or at least trying to? Again, they resisted, but trying to abuse the Justice Department the way that the president tried to do?
It's flabbergasting. No, I can't. I not only can I not think of another example that's like this, I can't even think of one that's close, to be honest, because what we have seen over now 5 hearings. The first one was an overview hearing that the Select Committee did, and then the rest of the 4 sort of drilled down on other parts of of the story to have a little bit more detail and evidence. Is that the kinds of extreme pressure we saw on Department of Justice officials. And then, of course, when people did not do the bidding, you saw, of course, Barr left. And the person you heard from most today were like Acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen, who was refusing to do the things that he was put in place to do after Barr refused to do them. And, going to Donahue, going to Engel. But the appalling thing is, aside from this weaponization of the Department of Justice to do the president's bidding to overturn the results of this election and to be part of this criminal conspiracy, we heard, at the last hearing about how there was a similar concurrent pressure campaign on state officials to be part of this conspiracy to overturn the election. And we heard, obviously, at the hearing before that, how there was a pressure campaign upon the vice president to ignore both constitutional duty and his duty under the Electoral Count Act. So I think it's the sheer scope. It's the scope of the plan, unauthorized pressure that was applied on so many different officials. What we heard about at DOJ merely echoes what we heard, the kinds of pressure upon state officials. And then, of course, prior to that, the vice president. And I suspect in future hearings, we'll hear about other pressure points.
I do wonder how big of an impact today's hearing will have. And the reason I say that is because if it was its own hearing without the previous hearings, it would, and maybe it still will be a big deal. I think this is getting more attention than perhaps people thought it would have. My understanding is there's many Republicans now who are concerned, who think the strategy not to really serve on this committee other than Kinzinger and Cheney may have been a bad one, because this is pretty damning when it comes to the president and the lawmakers who supported him. But I do wonder if this was the only hearing we were having about the Justice Department, I think it would be a really big deal about what happened. But if it almost got lost, because it didn't just happen in the Justice Department, it happened with the Vice President, Mike Pence. It happened with Trump's own attorneys talking about these allegations of fraud. And as you mentioned, it happened at the state level.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that obviously this would have been a blockbuster hearing on its own, and the fact that this has gone on, in multiple hearings, is unprecedented. I do think the committee has done a good job of both pacing it as well as making the connections. So hopefully that the thread won't be lost. I'm hoping that the public won't lose the thread or interest in this, and that in some sense, the fact that there are even more surprising things with each hearing doesn't minimize the impact of any one of them on their own. But I at least think, following from this, that I think they've done a good job tying this together for the American public. I mean, only time will tell how this resonates with the various audiences that I think they're speaking to.
I am hearing from people who are questioning, well, what's going to come out of this? And of course, this committee in of itself is only tasked with coming up with a final report about its investigation and then making recommendations. There is a concurrent but separate investigation going on by the Justice Department as well, which I guess the Justice Department, if it decided to, could prosecute some of the top administration officials, maybe even Donald Trump himself. Can you walk me through a little bit what's important to understand, sort of compare and contrast what the DOJ is doing with its own investigation and what this committee is doing?
Sure. The Select Committee, this bipartisan Select Committee, and its, cadre of professional career investigators that is doing this is really at this point engaged in the task of presenting the results of its meticulous 10-month investigation. These over 100 subpoenas, the 140,000 roughly documents that they have reviewed, the all of the leads, the conversations they have had, 1,000 depositions and interviews with witnesses, and they are at this point engaged in presenting the story, telling the story of how this, came about. Not only January 6th, the events of January 6th, but the criminal conspiracy that led up to that day and continued after that. And so I think they're about telling the story. You're right that there are a variety of different folks that can then act upon the information that is coming out. DOJ is clearly one of them. DOJ, as we know, doesn't have to wait. They are already moving and investigating, and in fact have secured prosecutions for a number of individuals that were involved, as you know, on January 6th. Now, whether this happens for high-ranking officials, we'll see. As I'm sure some of your viewers know, there was in fact today a search made of the home of Jeffrey Clark, and so what you see here is that what's legally significant there, that means for them to have issued this pre-dawn search of Jeffrey Clark's home, it means that they needed a warrant, right? And that warrant means that they had to prove before a judge and have a judge-approved finding of probable cause that there was evidence of a crime and that there was evidence of the crime on the premises. So, that's the kind of thing that they needed before they made that search. So I think this shows that DOJ is taking seriously its role and does not have to wait until the end of these hearings to do the things they need to do to figure out whether, a prosecution is warranted. I will also say, if I'm not going too long, is that there are other concurrent investigations that are going on. The Select Committee is laying a factual predicate for bunch of different audiences. The federal DOJ is one of them, but as you know, there are state and local investigations that are ongoing. As you know, Fani Willis, the DA in Fulton County, Georgia, is looking into charges there about the explicit request to tamper with the results there, the request to find votes that weren't warranted by the actual will of the voters there in Georgia. Separately, through these hearings, there might be other, consumer fraud charges potentially by DAs that and attorney generals that are brought up, and then of course they're the American people. They're the voters who are hopefully listening and watching these hearings and will make decisions accordingly.
Could Georgia or any state charge the president, the former president himself?
I see no reason.
That's a big question.
Why that couldn't happen. Yeah, I see no reason why that couldn't happen. If there is a clear state offense of state law, and that's happened, and it's a former president who committed an offense, if the factual predicate and all of the dots are connected, I don't see any reason why that's impossible. And again, we will see that as that meticulous work is done by state and local, prosecutors, whether it is the Fulton County DA or whether it's one somewhere else. But I don't see a legal reason why that couldn't happen.
Well, that's interesting. That's interesting to think about as well. I mean, sooner, I couldn't help but think, when you think of Henry Kissinger, he has to be careful of some of the countries he goes to. What if we had a president who had to be careful of some of the states he had to go to? Though maybe that would work differently nationally.
Yeah, I mean, I think so obviously if you're talking about an offense of Georgia law, et cetera, yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating parallel, and I think we'll just have to wait to see what the information, sort of bears out. And I think just as the Select Committee is trying to follow the facts and the law wherever they lead, I think there are other institutional actors, whether it's federal prosecutors or state and local prosecutors, who similarly are following where the facts and law lead them. Obviously, we're dealing with different bodies of law, either violations of federal law or violations of, in your example, Georgia law.
There are many of them, who want to see the Justice Department, Merrick Garland, to prosecute Donald Trump. I guess there's a lot of questions about doing that may not make it sound just so how easy it could actually be. On one hand, I don't think we've ever had a Justice Department prosecute, indict, charge a former president. I remember when Barack Obama came into office, there were those who wanted Obama administration to investigate the Bush administration for its handling on war on terrorism, such things as torture and issues around weapons of mass destruction. Of course, the Obama administration didn't do that. And there is a sense that a president in a White House wants to be very wary about doing that, because one day they'll be the former president and you'll have a new president in who may, do you want to set the precedent of investigating previous administrations? But on the other hand, if this really was an attempted coup by the president, and he clearly didn't have the support to pull it off. That's something else that we are learning through these set of hearings, is that he didn't have the support to pull something like this off. You just can't do it by yourself. You just can't say, I am the dictator and everyone's going to follow. You have to have a certain level of support to pull it off. But that said, it's pretty clear he tried, and he probably would have if he could have. And then what does it mean? Because here's another precedent. If you don't prosecute him, then what does that also mean for the future? What do you think?
There are a lot of big questions embedded in there, Mitch. I think you're right. It's a very difficult decision matrix. I'm not, and obviously I don't want to get ahead of my skis. The hearings are going to continue. The investigations are ongoing. As you heard from the Select Committee, they've already pulled down the hearings that a lot of people thought would happen next week, and have said that they're going to, potentially continue this into July and August because there's new information that's come in. So in some sense, the current hearings have been successful enough that they have led to new information and new folks coming out and potentially the need to re-interview certain witnesses. But I think what you're pointing to is that, yes, it is unprecedented for DOJ to prosecute, a former president. But I think also we're seeing a fact pattern that's unprecedented. So it's a little hard. I think no one wants to see a political scenario in which new administrations investigate or prosecute former presidents because they were presidents. On the other hand, no one wants to see a place where clear violations of law are excused because someone was a president. I think if we start with the general principle that nobody is above the law, that sort of cuts both ways. We don't want people prosecuted because of jobs they had as an act of political retribution, but we also don't want people insulated for the consequences from the consequences of breaking the law simply because they were a president. And so, it's a difficult decision, but I would hate for us to move into a place where we insulated certain behaviors simply because of political considerations.
It's a heavy situation. I mean, if you just look at Congress, Republicans have already threatened to put retaliatory investigations in place if they win the House of Representatives next year, to even investigate this committee that's investigating, to investigate the investigators. But then, like you said, then what's the alternative? Giving impunity for people wrongdoing? I guess people would say, well, there's plenty of presidents who have done wrongdoing. They've always had impunity. But I'm just opining. I'm throwing sort of big, maybe even crazy questions to you, Praveen.
Right. Well, so I'm not sure that there have been prior presidents who've acted in a way that has been so publicly documented and aired. Again, we now have very clear Select Committee documents. We have video footage. We have in-person testimony. In lots of ways, this is different than things like Watergate, where the majority of those hearings were trying to just figure out in real time what happened. Here we're having hearings that are actually revealing the findings that have happened over the last 10 and a half months. So there's been a lot of, careful work by these career investigators who were hired by this Bipartisan Select Committee to sort of drill down on the evidence. I'm not sure that we've had a factual record that is this detailed before. And again, I'm not a historian, so I'm saying off the cuff, I don't remember anything that is anything like this. But of course, maybe there's a historian that is listening right now that might disagree. I will say, when you talked about members of Congress, one of the more striking things was towards the end of the hearing, and I don't know whether you heard this part, but with a listing of, some of the members of Congress who asked for preemptive pardons before the end of the administration. And I think, that at least is some acknowledgement that these individuals recognized that what they did was against the law. I mean, you don't ask for a pardon for something you think is unimpeachable. And so I think it's striking that a number of, and there were many that were named. There were at least 5 that I quickly scribbled down that had been named, but had sought preemptive pardons. And, and some of them sought pardons as early as in December, so predating January 6th. So, I think that there's an ongoing appetite to figure out, what is it that drove that request for pardons? What sort of actions and what kinds of involvement did these individuals have that they were worried about? Again,
I wrote down 5 as well, potentially a 6th one. There were Matt Gaetz, Andy Biggs, Mo Brooks, Louis Gohmert, Scott Perry, and a potential 6th one, Jim Jordan. It wasn't clear. Apparently, Jim Jordan inquired as to whether there would be pardons for congressional members, but they did not say if he actually was seeking a pardon for himself. So something hopefully we'll learn more about in the future. Praveen Fernandes, that was interesting, and I thank you for entertaining those questions with me, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having with me. Thank you.
It's great. Praveen Fernandes has been our guest, Vice President at the Constitution.